Combat Arts Institute of Australia.
Hi everyone, Ron from Combat Arts Institute of Australia here. Today I want to talk about a topic that's close to my heart, and that's what I call the dojo syndrome. Now, before I go on and explain exactly what the dojo syndrome is, as well as how we take care of it, I want to highlight a couple of important things. Number one, everything that I talk about today is in the context of self-defense training. And while some of it certainly applies to competition martial arts such as MMA, Muay Thai, boxing, BJJ, etc., or traditional martial arts, I'm speaking specifically with reference to self-defense training or Krav Maga, which is what I focus on most of the time. Number two, there are many examples of dojo syndromes, and it's impossible to eliminate all of them all of the time in every training session, for the sole reason that they are what makes training as opposed to a real live incident, to a degree at least. So it's impossible to eliminate all of them all of the time, but when we do include them, we need to be aware of what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, when we're doing it, so on and so forth. Okay. So what is the dojo syndrome? The dojo syndrome is what happens when we make our training unrealistic in the dojo, most of the time for the sake of helping our training partners achieve the goal of the training, which most of the time is to perform a particular technique or deal with a particular scenario. Okay, so one more time, the dojo syndrome is what happens when we make our training unrealistic for the sake of making the techniques work in the dojo. This is a term that we borrow from Dr. Gabriel Schneider, who's a phenomenal self-defense practitioner from Brisbane, Australia. And like I said, there's many examples of different dojo syndromes. So I'm going to look at 4 today, and over the next few videos, I'll cover a few more. Okay, so dojo syndrome number 1. This is what I call the dummy. The dummy is what happens when our training partners start to act like Wing Chun dummies or punching bags. In other words, they'll throw a particular strike and they leave the limb extended for the sake of us being able to move, block, lock, throw, whatever it might be. In other words, if they throw, let's say, a right cross, they'll throw the cross and they'll leave the arm there so that you can perform the technique on the arm. That could be, doing a lock or blocking it or sidestepping it or doing whatever it is that you want to do. Okay? Now, why is this a bad habit? A couple of reasons. Number one, we know that real attacks don't happen that way. Nobody will ever just throw one strike. Maybe if they knock you out in the first one, they may not throw another one. Maybe. But most of the time, what we see is that people throw a strike, and then they'll throw another one, and they'll throw another one, and they'll throw another one. And nothing stays static for very long. In other words, they throw the limb, and they retract it right back while they throw something else. Okay, so if we train ourselves to deal with a limb that is static, we're teaching ourselves that that's what's going to happen in a real fight, and it won't. In which case, you won't be able to perform the stuff that you've trained on because it simply won't be there for you to perform on. Number 2 is from the perspective of the person who's throwing the attack, we teach ourselves bad habits because we teach ourselves to throw and leave the hand out there instead of throwing and retracting the arm straight away. Okay, and if you've ever done any sparring, you know that that's pretty much one of the first things that you find out doesn't work. If you throw an attack and leave the hand for too long, somebody will hit you right back because you'll be open. Okay, so this is something we need to be aware of. So the best way to overcome the dummy is to simply retract your arm every time and get into the habit of doing it. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to do things fast. It just means that you have to be able to retract the arm. So even if I do it very slowly, I throw the strike, I extend, I bring the hand back, and then I'll throw something else. Okay, so the training partner gets used to a moving target and a moving limb. So that's number 1, that's the dummy. Number two is what I call the shaped fighter. The shaped fighter is something that we see a lot in training, especially when people cross-train in other disciplines that are more sport-oriented. So, if you do, like MMA or boxing, Muay Thai, or something like that, what happens when we start doing drills for self-defense? Usually people can like touch gloves and they'll get into their fighting stance, whatever your fighting stance is, and they'll go from there. Now, the problem with that is that if you walk down the street one day, to your car after work, and somebody walks up to you like this, you know what's coming next. Yeah, they've already put their hands up, they're walking towards you aggressively, they're making fists, chances are they're going to start hitting you as soon as they get in a range. So if we train ourselves that it's okay for somebody to stand in front of you with their fists raised, you train yourself in a way to be a victim. You train yourself that it's okay to react when the strike is coming, as opposed to being proactive. So 2 ways to overcome the shaped fighter in training. Number one is when people throw the strikes at you or they work the techniques, they need to do it from something that's a bit more realistic. And that could be, like pointing, pushing, doing things with their hands that are a bit more realistic. And then throwing from there when you're not expecting it. And then you're forced to deal with that. Number two is that if the person is starting to shape up, straight away, you need to either run away or you need to move in and do what we call smash the guard and start hitting them, because you know the attack is coming. We know the action is faster than the reaction. If they're putting their hands up and throwing and you're waiting to deal with it, you're going to get hammered. Okay, so that's the shaped fighter. Alrighty, number three, that's what we call the trained fighter. And sometimes the problem with doing self-defense training with other people who are also experienced martial artists is that we throw strikes in a manner that is technically correct, because we practice doing that. We practice how to throw a nice jab and a nice cross and hooks and uppercuts and all that kind of stuff. We practice how to generate power and move and keep our defense active while we do it. That's all great, fantastic, and so you should. The problem is that when we look at real-world violence, it doesn't happen that way. And one of the things that then happens is we train ourselves to deal with angles of attack that are often not realistic. So most of the time when we see straight punches in self-defense, they don't come straight down the pipe. A lot of the time they'll come out a little bit. When we look at hooks, they won't be nice tight hooks. They'll be these big kind of overhand haymaker, king hit type things. And when you train with people who are very experienced, sometimes we forget that. And we start training in a trained way, right? So that can be a real problem, because remember that an attacker is not going to attack in the angles that you have specifically practiced for. They can attack in any angle that they want. So a couple of ways of tackling the trained fighter syndrome. The first one is what we call chaos sparring, which is a term that we borrow from Master Manny D'Amatos, who's a phenomenal self-defense and boxing coach. And what we do when we look at chaos sparring is we do sparring, and it can be sparring in any parameters that you want. So it can be boxing, kickboxing, MMA, so on and so forth. But one person purposely throws like an untrained fighter. They'll put their head down, they'll throw big looping strikes, their straights won't be exactly straight, their hooks won't be correct hooks, their kicks will be ugly, and technique will be horrible. But it forces you to deal with attacks that are not something that you are likely to see in the dojo, but are more likely to see in the real world. So that's a really good way of dealing with it. The second way of dealing with it is simply doing similar things with scenario training, when the attacker purposely throws ugly strikes. So those two ways are really good ways of dealing with the trained fighter. The third one, which I particularly really like, it also helps build a good atmosphere and a community spirit in the dojo, is to train with beginners. So especially if you're a little bit more advanced, when you train with beginners, a lot of time they'll catch you with things that you don't expect because they throw in angles that are not trained because they simply don't know how to perform the techniques. And that's the best kind of training you can get for self-defense. A lot of time they won't have great control of their power, or their angles will be weird, they'll throw too slow or too quick. And a lot of time you see that that's when people actually get hit. It's not when they train with people who are really good, but when people are really bad. The other benefit of that is that you're helping new people develop their technique. So that's number 3. Okay. The fourth dojo syndrome we're going to look at is what I call the "I'm so sorry." I'm going to borrow another phrase from Master Manny de Matos, and this is really one of my favorites. The two inevitabilities of self-defense or martial arts or combat sports, whichever one you indulge in, is number 1, another human being is going to hit you. And number 2, you're going to have to hit another human being. Now, those are things that are really hard to come to terms with for most people because we are taught from a young age that it's not okay to hit people and it's not okay to be hit, and so we should. But at the same time, if you have never experienced hard contact, then I can guarantee you that no matter how technically capable you are, if somebody, God forbid, tries to really hurt you and you clock a hard one and it's the first time you've ever been hit, you're going to crumble. Physically, emotionally, mentally, you're going to crumble. The other thing that happens is if people get hit a lot, but they don't practice giving, so they know how to receive, but they don't know how to give it, they'll do the reason we call it the "I'm so sorry." And we see this in training when a training partner hits you and straight away go, "Oh, I'm so sorry, are you okay?" And there's a time and a place for this, but it can't be every time and it can't be forever because, again, you're training yourself that when push comes to shove, almost literally, right? You don't want to push and you don't want to shove. You don't want to hit. So we need to be able to give and we need to be able to receive and we need to be able to pull that trigger when it's time to pull that trigger. And the only real way of practicing that is do stuff with hard contact. It doesn't mean you have to do it every time and all the time and forever because we don't want to go home with concussions after every training session, but you certainly need to practice it. You need to know what it feels like to cop a hard hit. You need to know what it feels like to give a hard hit. It's the only way to overcome the "I'm so sorry" dojo syndrome. So there we go, guys. Here are 4 dojo syndromes, as well as a few ways of how to deal with them. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to give us a call and visit our website and make sure you read all of the blogs. Thank you very much. Os!